Hi everyone. Have you ever been in a potentially embarrassing scenario where someone places a public challenge to your faith, but you have limited time to counteract the challenge? Like you want to minister to the person, but you're pressed for time, but you don't want to appear necessarily sharp or offensive. So today I will be sharing with you a useful but simple tactic that is effective in actually handling these types of situations. What am I talking about? So I'm going to be discussing chapter 3 of Greg Koukl's book, Tactics, and let's look to learn more. So in chapter 3 of Greg Koukl's book, he introduces what we'll be calling the Colombo tactic. So this tactic is actually named after a character of a 1970s television series called Lieutenant Colombo. This character actually solved problems by asking seemingly innocent but strategic questions. So even though he came off very simple, he was very effective in his detective work and actually solved the mysteries. So applying this in apologetics, we find that it is also effective when we are dealing with objections to the faith. So Greg actually calls this tactic the queen mother of all tactics because of its simplicity and its effectiveness. So why should we use the Colombo tactic in actually asking questions to respond to objections? So number one, this actually helps you not to misconstrue the objector's point of view when responding. It's important that when someone asks us a question and we're answering, we're actually dealing with what they asked and not assuming things. So it's very helpful to ask a question to clarify what they're asking so that we're not misconstruing what they actually believe. It also helps to let down the guard of objectors because when we ask questions, many times persons do feel like they're being heard. It might seem less offensive to objectors and perhaps open them to hear more of the truth without us seeming too pushy or abrupt. Another useful thing of asking questions, in response to objections is that it relieves the asker of the burden of proof. So while the person who has the objection, they have to clarify their objection. So it actually reduces the likelihood of you becoming tongue-tied in objections, which many times that just is bound to happen, especially if you're not necessarily as comfortable with a topic that they bring up to you. So essentially how Greg puts it in the book, it says that it puts you in the driver's seat of the conversation. And since you asked the question, there's actually nothing for you to defend. It's up to the objector to clarify what he's saying, to defend his point of view while you guide the discussion with questions. Another useful reason that this is effective, asking questions is effective, is that it buys time in a conversation to help you think more thoroughly of what you're going to say next. And that can be very important. And another final point of why this is effective is that it reveals the weaknesses of the views of objectors and making them do personal soul searching. So for these 5 reasons, Greg actually puts forward that this tactic of asking questions to actually respond to objections, at least in the initial stage of a conversation, is very effective. But not only that, we actually do find that Jesus himself used questions several times when he was actually faced with objections. So, for example, you see in Luke 20, verse 24, when the Pharisees wanted to actually trap Jesus and was asking, should we pay the taxes to the Roman governor? Is it lawful? Jesus said, show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? So they actually now have to do their admission, and then Jesus goes on forward with his point to evade the traps that they're trying to set for him. Another example is the question, was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? Another example of a question that Jesus used in response to objections was when Jesus said, which is easier, to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, arise, take up your pallet and walk? So in all of these scenarios, when you know you're actually facing hostility, Sometimes it's actually good to get the person themselves to actually see the folly of the argument themselves without you even directly saying it back to them. So now that we actually know what and why, what the Columba tactic is and why it's useful, let's just discuss a bit how to apply the Columba tactic in apologetics. So Greg actually gave us 3 purposes of questions that we can ask to objectors. Number 1, the purpose can be for information gathering, to learn more. That's usually the first step when we ask a question, because you want to make sure you understand exactly what the person is getting at without assuming. The second purpose of asking questions can be to reverse the burden of proof. So you're basically encouraging the person to give reasons for their own views. Many times that actually ends up showing themselves the weaknesses of what they thought was a clever question to trap you. So that's the second purpose of asking questions. And we will also be discussing some scenarios specifically of how this looks like in real life. And then the third purpose of asking questions is leading the conversation in a specific direction. So now let's just look at some of the scenarios where we can apply the Columba tactic in apologetics. All right, now category 1, information gathering questions. Firstly, before we go into the scenarios, why should we use fact gathering questions? As I mentioned before, it's important to know what a person thinks, what the significance of what they hold dear, so you have the less assumptions when you're actually interacting with them. It's very important not to misrepresent opposer's position, because that will be fallacious, a straw man fallacy, to go and create something that they're not actually saying. It's useless to actually do that. So it's important to actually gather the facts of why they say what they're saying. Especially the third scenario of why fact gathering is important. Many times you'll find objectors, they give vague statements. So it's important that you get them to be more specific so that you know exactly where to tackle, and not just for them to dance around in a vague, with their vague statements, right? So now let's look at some scenarios of how we can use these information gathering questions. So claim 1, if someone comes to you saying everything is relative, we can ask them, what do you mean by relative, right? And then another even more important question is, would you apply that to your own statement? So is that statement, everything is relative, is that only your opinion, or are you saying an absolute statement? So it's self-refuting, right? Another fact gathering question is that we're looking at the scenario now for the claim, there is no proof for God. Belief in God is irrational. If someone comes to you with that, how are you going to handle that? So one possible question that you can ask is, what do you mean by God? That is, what kind of God do you reject? So the value of this first question, we want to make sure that we know what is in the person's mind. Does the person have a warped view of who God is to begin with? So do we need to dispel their false idea of who God is? Or have they in fact rejected the God of the Bible? Because we can't assume that they're always have the right concept of what God has revealed himself as. So let them clarify, what do they think God really is, or who they think God really is, and then you tackle and see, you'll have a better footing to actually deal with what they think, right? Another question is, you're asking, what specifically is irrational about believing in God? And again, because they did not say what makes it irrational, they're being vague and they're standing on that vagueness, but you need something more specific to tackle. So is it that they're thinking that, for example, it's irrational to believe that God loves everyone but still punishes sin? And then you go on, if they say that, you know exactly what angle to tackle, right? And another question is that you can use to, start an apologetics conversation with this is, since you're concerned about proof of God's existence, what kind of evidence would you find acceptable? I particularly like this one very, very much. Why? So it really pushes the opposer to actually propose a standard by which the claim can be falsified. So many times you'll find in conversations, persons, if they will be, it's easy for them, no matter how much proof you give them, they can just dismiss it and say, it's not enough proof. I still don't believe. But if you hold them to their word, if they actually say, okay, if something violated a law of physics or a scientific law, then I know that that's a proof of God. So get them to tell you, what would they expect to see if God exists, right? So you then can hold them to that standard and show them the proofs based on the standard that they have said that they're looking for. All right. So let's look for another scenario here. Now, on the second technique of questioning, reversing the burden of proof. So one scenario here is a claim that reincarnation was originally part of the Christian teaching, but was taken out of the Bible in the 4th century. That's a quote from the book, that they have a claim that how would you refute this? So they're making a truth claim, a claim about what they think actually happened in history, yet they have not given you the evidence of that. So you can ask them just generally, where's the evidence? How did you get that? But also you can also ask the process by which they propose that this could have even been possible. So how does someone remove select lines of text from tens of thousands of handwritten documents that had been circulating around the Mediterranean region for over 300 years? Like, is that even a plausible scenario that could have really happened? And what evidence is there that this actually happened? So in asking these questions, the person is forced to think back and say, well, I never thought of it that way. I never actually questioned. They just many times just hold on to these objections without seeing how valid they are. So when you ask them back, they are now on a foot that they must reconsider their claims, right? Another scenario of reversing the burden of truth is if someone says Christianity is basically the same of other religions. The main similarity is love. We shouldn't tell anyone or tell others how to live or believe. No, that's a very common objection. So how do you use questions to reverse the burden of proof for this? All right, so number one, well, we would start with fact gathering. So a question could be, how much have you studied other religions to compare the details and find a common theme? So that question has a value to force the person to self-examine how naive they might actually be. So they might actually come up and admit to you, well, it's not really that I've read the Quran. I haven't even, do you know even one verse in it? How much do you actually know from what you're saying? So it might actually let them realize that they actually don't have the proof that they are alleging that they do have, right? You want to maybe ask as well, how would the similarities be more important than the differences? So in asking a question like that, you'd be tackling an underlying assumption that similarities are more important than differences. So Greg actually has in his book a question that is very thought-provoking. So you have aspirin and you have arsenic. They can both be in tablet form, but does that make them essentially the same? One is poisonous and one can be used to cure symptoms of a headache, for example. Just because there are some similarities does not mean that their essence is not more important in terms of their differences. So that invalidates it, right? And another question that you could ask is, I'm curious, what do you think Jesus's own attitude on this issue would be? Did he think that all religions were basically equal? And a final question, which I also love this one, isn't telling people to love one another just another example of telling them how they should live and believe? So they were criticizing persons who, like Christians, who might advocate for, against abortion, for example, and they think that, you should not be having these things, like we should not be imposing our ideas, but in saying that, okay, all religions, the basic thing is love, so we all should live by love and not be, caught up in the details. But they're actually doing the same thing and picking out, why do you pick out love? Why do you think everybody should live by love? You're actually showing the opposer how self-contradictory their statement is without telling them. So you're going to ask them, isn't telling people to love one another just another example of telling them how they should live and believe, right? All right, one of the few final ones that I have here, directing the conversation. So if someone comes to you with a claim, you can't take the Bible too seriously because it was only written by men and men make mistakes. All right, the approach of Greg is first, at least lead them little by little. So not necessarily to have, a truth bomb of all the inspirational evidence of the Bible, even though that is very, very useful. But you could even take it step by step and ask them, so do you have any books in your library? Were those books written by humans? And do you find any truth in them? Is there a reason you think the Bible is less truthful or reliable than other books you own? And do people always make mistakes when they write? So these questions actually, even though it does not tell you that the Bible is inspired, it lets them think, why do they trust some sources of information but not the Bible? Get them to at least justify why the Bible is not at least worthy of consideration as other writings. And so they can at least listen. So while this is definitely not, you should not stop the conversation here. This is a starter. And what Greg was saying in the book was that many times persons accept Christianity when they actually get a personal encounter with God. So the first step is getting them to actually have a heart to listen, right? Even if you don't give them all the facts, prophecies being fulfilled, scientific foreknowledge, all of these different things. Why is it they do have to believe something? So why is it, how do you evaluate and accept some books and not the Bible, right? So a fourth question is that, do you think that if God did exist, he would be capable of using humans to write down exactly what he wants? If not, why not? And the value of that question is to understand the opposer's underlying assumptions about God and his abilities. Now, that is very important. And then you can steer the conversation in that way. So just one of our final, examples here for today is a claim where someone might say, it's wrong to force your views on other people. You can't legislate morality. Christians involved in politics violate the separation of church and state. Now, that is quite popular, especially in the US context. So how would you ask questions to direct the conversation in this scenario? So Greg has some series of questions that he proposes. So the first of which is, do you vote? Right? So when you vote for someone, are you expecting your candidate to pass laws reflecting your point of view? Wouldn't that be essentially forcing your views on others? How is that different from what you are troubled about here, right? So the value of these questions is to let the opposer introspect whether they are guilty of what they claim others are doing. A second question is it your view that only non-religious people should be allowed to vote or participate in politics? Or did I misunderstand you, right? Because they're speaking about religion, even though people with religion are also citizens who also vote and who also have a right to have their voices heard in the political process. So is it that only non-religious people should be allowed to vote, right? A third question that he proposes here is, what specifically in the Constitution are religious people? Where specifically are they excluded from the political process? So we're trying to get them, to see, okay, to justify what they're saying. So that's a little burden of proof. And then, can you give me an example of legislation that does not have a moral element in it? I think that fourth question is a very, very important question, right? So it lets them introspect on what the purpose of legislation is. Isn't morality the only thing that a good government can legislate. So he mentioned even from Aristotle, the Greek scholar, that he even as a Greek, even though he was not, he was pagan, right? So he even still recognized that there is morality, that anything that is not illicit that a government says, it has to be for the common good at the very least, which has to have a moral element to it. So if there is something that is applying to the entire country, it must have something to do with what is perceived as right and wrong, and what standard are you going to use for that. So it's very important that we ask questions like this to direct the conversation. And there are many, many more tactics that Greg has in his book. I encourage you to look even online for it and get a copy, and continue to tune in. Come, let us reason together, saith the Lord. And I hope you learned from our presentation. Wishing you a blessed rest of your day.